The wind that whipped through Oak Haven's town square was not merely cold, it was malicious. It carried the scent of wood smoke, cheap rye whiskey, and the metallic tang of freezing mud. It gnawed through thin wool coats, biting at the skin beneath, a constant reminder to the town's poorest that winter in the Ozarks was a slow, creeping death. Cora Vance stood on the rough pine planks of the auction block, her hands bound loosely in front of her with coarse hemp rope. She was 24, clad in a threadbare grey dress that offered no defense against the gale. Her left leg, ruined by a childhood fever, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that radiated up to her hip. But the pain in her leg was nothing compared to the agony of the stairs. Her face was turned away from the wind, exposing the left side of her neck and jaw. There, sprawled across her pale skin like a spilled vial of dark wine, was the birthmark. It was jagged, prominent, and to the superstitious, cruel folk of Oak Haven, it was the mark of the devil. "Step up, gentlemen. Don't let the weather freeze your wallets." Horace Bloodhorn, the town's auctioneer and primary debt collector, paced the platform beside her. He was a man built like a rain barrel, thick and sweating despite the cold, his face perpetually flushed with gin and greed. He tapped a heavy oak gavel against his palm, his small, piggish eyes surveying the crowd of bundled miners, loggers, and farmers. "Today we settle the debts of the late unlamented Thomas Vance," Bloodhorn bellowed, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. $10 owed to the mercantile, $10 owed to the livery. And what did he leave behind? Not a copper piece, only this. He reached out and grabbed Cora by the shoulder, jerking her forward. Her weak leg buckled slightly and she stumbled, catching herself awkwardly. The crowd chuckled. It was an ugly scraping sound. "Careful now," a logger shouted from the back. "She'll break before you can get her home." "She's already broken, boys." Bloodhorn laughed, slapping his thigh. "Look at her. A bad leg and a face that would curdle milk. Now, I ain't going to lie to you fine Christian men. This ain't a prime piece of stock." Cora closed her eyes. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw breath. She had begged Bloodhorn to let her work off the debt. She had offered to scrub floors, wash laundry, mend clothes until her fingers bled. But Bloodhorn didn't want labor. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to remind the town what happened to those who died owing him money. "She can sew, I'm told," Bloodhorn continued, his tone dripping with mock consideration. "And she don't eat much, but let's be honest. Who wants to wake up to that stain on the pillow? Who wants a wife that walks like a busted wagon wheel? If you're liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue." The laughter swelled, crueler now, a chorus of jeers from men who were eager to direct their own miseries at someone weaker. "I'll tell you what," Bloodhorn said, raising his hands for silence. "Since the mercantile needs its due and I'm a generous man, I won't ask for $1. I won't even ask for a dime. Let's start the bidding at 1 single red cent." He slammed the gavel down on the podium. 1 cent. For the crippled, stained daughter of Thomas Vance. Do I hear 1 cent? Come on, boys. Surely someone has a pig that needs feeding. 1 cent. The crowd erupted. Men doubled over, slapping each other on the back. "A cent's too much." Someone yelled. "Pay me $1 to take her." Cora's vision blurred with unshed tears. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to let them see her cry. "I am nothing," the wind seemed to whisper in her ear. "You are worth less than the dirt on their boots." Then the laughter stopped. It didn't taper off. It was severed instantly, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the square. Cora opened her eyes. The men in the front row were stepping backward, pressing into the people behind them, their faces draining of color. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the jeers. The thud of massive hooves echoed on the frozen mud. A rider entered the square. He was a giant of a man, seated atop a black draft horse that looked like it had been bred in hellfire. The man wore a coat fashioned from the thick, coarse fur of a grizzly bear, the hide still bearing the scars of battle. His face was a shadowed landscape of untamed black beard and hard, uncompromising lines. A heavy Sharps buffalo rifle rested across the pommel of his saddle. Silas Boone. He was a ghost story the town told to frighten children. The mountain man who lived high in the jagged, impassable crags of the Devil's Backbone. He only came down to trade pelts twice a year, and when he did, he spoke to no one, paid in gold dust, and left a trail of unnerved silence in his wake. He pulled the massive black horse to a halt directly in front of the auction block. Bloodhorn swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. Mr. Boone, he stammered, the gavel trembling in his hand. We ain't trading furs today. Silas didn't look at Bloodhorn. His eyes, a pale, piercing grey, like winter ice over a deep river, were fixed on Cora. He saw the way she held her weight off her left leg. He saw the dark, sprawling mark on her neck. He saw the tremble in her thin shoulders, the absolute paralyzing terror in her eyes. And beneath all of that, he saw the spark of a woman trying desperately to hold on to the last shred of her dignity. You said a cent, Silas rumbled. His voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that seemed to originate from the earth itself. It carried easily over the wind. Bloodhorn blinked, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was a joke, Boone. She ain't worth. I ain't laughing, Silas interrupted softly. He didn't reach into his coat for a coin. He didn't pull out a pouch of gold dust. He reached to his heavy leather belt and untied a small, thick pouch made of cured elk hide. He held it up. He didn't toss it. He leaned over from the saddle and dropped it onto the wooden podium next to Bloodhorn's gavel. It hit the wood with a sharp, heavy clack. The worn leather string gave way, and the pouch fell open. A gasp rippled through the front row of the crowd. They weren't coins. They weren't gold dust. They were raw, uncut diamonds. Dozens of them. Cloudy, jagged stones the size of peas and acorns, rough-hewn from the deep, hidden caves of the high peaks where no other man dared to tread. In their raw state they looked like lumps of dirty ice, but any man who knew the earth knew their worth. It was a fortune, enough to buy the entire town of Oakhaven and burn it to the ground just for the warmth. Bloodhorn stared at the stones, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. That covers the $10, Silas said, his pale eyes finally shifting to the auctioneer. The look was lethal. And the interest? He swung his massive leg over the saddle and dropped to the mud. The ground seemed to shudder under his weight. He walked up the 3 wooden steps to the auction block. The crowd held its collective breath. Silas stopped in front of Cora. He towered over her, blocking out the wind, blocking out the jeering faces of the town. He smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and the cold, thin air of the high altitude. He looked down at her bound hands. He reached into his belt, pulling a massive curved skinning knife. Cora flinched, closing her eyes tight. Snick. The hemp rope fell away from her wrists. She opened her eyes. Silas was returning the knife to its sheath. He didn't look at the birthmark. He didn't look at her bad leg. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. Yes, Cora whispered, her throat dry as dust. Good. He turned his back to the stunned crowd. He didn't say a word to Bloodhorn, who was frantically scooping the raw diamonds back into the pouch with shaking, greedy hands. Silas walked down the steps. He didn't wait to see if Cora would follow. He knew she had no choice. Cora forced her weak leg to move. She stumbled down the steps, the cold biting at her newly freed wrists. When she reached the massive black horse, she stopped, unsure how she was supposed to mount such a beast. Silas didn't hesitate. He reached out with 2 massive hands, spanning her waist completely. He lifted her effortlessly, setting her gently onto the saddle sideways, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. He swung up behind her, his broad chest pressing against her back, his arms coming around her to grab the reins. "Hold on," he commanded. He spurred the horse. The beast surged forward, parting the crowd like a black ship cutting through a muddy sea. No one spoke. No one jeered. The men of Oakhaven watched in terrified silence as the mountain man who dealt in diamonds rode out of the square, taking the girl they had offered for a penny into the unforgiving, frozen moor of the Ozark Peaks. Cora clung to the saddle horn, the heat of the giant behind her, the only thing keeping the ice from freezing her blood, wondering if she had just been bought from a cruel master by a monster. The ascent was a brutal, vertical punishment. Oakhaven quickly disappeared beneath a blanket of grey fog, replaced by the jagged, unforgiving teeth of the devil's backbone. The trail, if it could be called that, was a narrow ribbon of frozen shale clinging to the edge of a sheer drop. The wind here did not howl, it shrieked, a high-pitched keening that threatened to tear Cora from the saddle and cast her into the abyss. She survived the journey only because of the man behind her. Silas Boone was a furnace of dense muscle and heavy fur, his broad chest acting as a windbreak against the gale. His massive arm remained wrapped securely around her waist, not in an embrace but as a rigid iron bar keeping her tethered to the beast beneath them. Cora kept her face tucked into the collar of her threadbare coat, her bad leg throbbing with a sickening rhythmic pulse as it hung awkwardly against the horse's flank. Diamonds, she thought, the word echoing absurdly in her mind over the roar of the wind. He paid diamonds for a cripple. It made no sense. Men like Horace Bloodhorn bought women to work them into the ground or use them in ways Cora dared not imagine. But a mountain man who dealt in fortunes? What use did a feral giant have for a woman who walked with a limp and wore the devil's mark on her throat? Hours bled into a freezing eternity. The pines grew sparse, replaced by ancient twisted cedars that clung stubbornly to the rock. Just as the feeling entirely left Cora's toes, the black draft horse crested a steep ridge and let out a huff of exhausted steam. "Whoa!" Silas rumbled, the vibration of his voice startling her. Cora forced her eyes open, her eyelashes heavy with frost. Built directly into the concave face of a towering granite cliff was a fortress. The cabin was constructed of massive, unpeeled pine logs, chinked with hardened mud and riverstone. It squatted low to the ground, its heavy sod roof designed to withstand the crushing weight of winter avalanches. There were no welcoming plumes of smoke from the fieldstone chimney, no warm light spilling from the narrow shuttered windows. It was a dark, brooding monument to isolation. Silas swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the frozen earth, his boots crunching loudly. He didn't ask if she was well. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He reached up, his massive, leather-clad hands spanning her waist, and lifted her from the horse. The moment her boots touched the ground, her ruined left leg gave out. Cora gasped, her knee buckling as the agonizing cramp seized her thigh. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting to hit the frozen dirt, waiting for the harsh bark of laughter or a curse for her clumsiness. It didn't come. Silas caught her. He didn't snatch her up. His grip was shockingly steady, holding her upright by her upper arms until she could balance her weight on her good leg. He looked down at her, his pale grey eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't look at the birthmark on her neck, exposed where her collar had slipped. In fact, he seemed to deliberately look past it, his gaze fixing somewhere near her ear. To Cora, the meaning was devastatingly clear. He cannot stand to look at it. He bought me out of pity, and now he is repulsed. "Inside," Silas commanded, releasing her as quickly as if she had burned him. He turned his broad back to her, unstrapping his Sharps rifle and a heavy sack of supplies from the saddle. Cora swallowed the thick knot of shame in her throat and limped toward the heavy oak door. She pushed it open, stepping into the freezing gloom. The cabin smelled of trapped time, curing pelts, wood ash, and a profound, suffocating loneliness. As Silas entered behind her, scraping a lucifer match against the doorframe to light a kerosene lantern, the yellow light chased the shadows into the corners. The space was a single, massive room. A heavy wooden table, scarred by knives and burns, dominated the center. Traps of varying, terrifying sizes hung from the ceiling, joists like iron teeth. In the far corner sat a large bed frame built from thick birch branches, piled 2 feet high with thick, coarse buffalo robes and bear pelts. Silas dropped his sack onto the table. He walked to the bed, grabbed a single thin wool blanket from beneath the furs, and threw it onto the hard, packed earth floor near the drafty door. "The bed is yours," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. Cora stared at him, bewildered. "But it's your home, Mr. Boone. I can sleep by the hearth. I am accustomed to the floor." "The bed is yours," Silas repeated, the tone lowering into a dangerous gravel. He didn't look at her. He turned to the massive fieldstone fireplace, grabbing a piece of kindling. "I sleep by the door. Don't touch the rifles. Don't go outside unless the cabin is burning down. The wind will strip the flesh from your bones." "Why?" Cora whispered, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. Her hands gripped the fabric of her skirt. "Why did you buy me? I am not. I cannot be what you want. I have a bad leg. I have this stain." She reached up, her trembling fingers touching the dark birthmark on her neck. Silas stopped. His massive shoulders tensed under the grisly coat. He slowly turned his head, his profile illuminated by the newly struck fire. He didn't look at the mark. He looked at the floorboards between them. "I bought you because you were for sale," he grunted, a lie so heavy it seemed to sink into the floor. "I need someone to keep the fire from dying while I check the lines. That's all." He stood up, grabbing a heavy coil of rope and a hatchet. "I have traps to clear before the ice storm hits," he said, walking to the door. "There's dried meat in the cellar. Don't wait up." The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving Cora alone in the cavernous, echoing silence of the mountain. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through the soles of her boots. The rejection stung worse than the freezing wind. He had paid a fortune in diamonds, yet he treated her like a stray dog he had taken in, out of the grudging obligation, too disgusted to share a space with her, too repulsed to even look her in the eye. "I will not be a charity case," Cora thought, a sudden fierce spark of anger igniting in her chest. "I will not be a penny's worth, and I will not be a burden." She forced herself to move. Her leg screamed in protest, a sharp, stabbing pain that made her grit her teeth, but she ignored it. She dragged her dragging foot across the floor, surveying her new domain. The cabin was built for a beast, not a man. The hearth was choked with 2 feet of cold grey ash. The iron pots were encrusted with old grease. The floor was scattered with pine needles and dried mud. Cora found a bucket. She limped to the back of the cabin where a narrow pipe fed by a mountain spring trickled into an iron basin. The water was paralyzingly cold, but she filled the bucket, hauling it back to the hearth. Her arms shook under the weight, her bad leg buckling twice, but she didn't drop it. She found a stiff broom made of bound twigs and swept the dirt floor until the packed earth was smooth. She knelt before the hearth, a grueling process that sent spikes of agony up her hip, and shoveled out the ash, stacking fresh, dry wood and building the fire from a struggling flicker into a roaring, heat-producing blaze. In a small root cellar beneath a loose floorboard, she found his larder, shriveled potatoes, wild onions, and a half-eaten side of cured venison that had grown hard as wood. She used his heavy butcher knife, throwing her entire body weight onto the handle to slice the meat, tossing it into a cast-iron pot with water and the vegetables to boil. As the stew began to simmer, filling the stale air of the cabin with a rich, savory aroma, Cora saw something thrown carelessly over a barrel in the corner. It was a heavy canvas winter coat, lined with rabbit fur. It had been shredded. 3 massive, jagged tears ripped down the back, the heavy fabric laid open, as if slashed by a set of razor-sharp claws. Silas could not wear it, which meant he was out in the approaching ice storm with only the grisly coat to protect him. Cora limped to the barrel. She picked up the coat. It was incredibly heavy, smelling of the man, of pine and of old blood. She searched the shelves near the bed and found a small tin box containing a rusted bone needle and a spool of thick, waxed sinew. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire, dragging the heavy coat onto her lap. The heat of the flames soaked into her aching leg, providing the first real comfort she had felt in days. She threaded the needle. Her hands were small, but they were not weak. She had sewn canvas tents, heavy grain sacks, and leather boots to keep her father from starving. She pushed the bone needle through the thick, resistant canvas, her thumb slipping and catching on the sharp end, drawing a drop of blood. She sucked the blood away and kept pushing. Over, under, pull tight. Lock the stitch. She worked for hours. The wind outside began to scream, the sound of sleet hitting the shutters like handfuls of thrown gravel. The cabin, however, was holding the heat. The fire roared. The stew bubbled. By the time the heavy door finally rattled on its iron hinges, Cora's fingers were stiff and cramping. But the 3 massive tears in the canvas coat were gone, replaced by neat, incredibly strong lines of locking stitches that would hold against a blizzard. Silas burst into the room with a violent gust of snow. He was a snowman built around a core of granite, Ice clung to his beard in thick icicles. He kicked the door shut, leaning his weight against it to drop the heavy iron bar into place. He expected the dark. He expected the freezing, empty silence of a cabin that had not felt the touch of a woman in a decade. He stopped dead, his massive chest heaving. The air was sweltering. The yellow glow of the fire danced across the clean floorboards. The overwhelming, mouth-watering smell of venison stew hit him like a physical blow. And there, sitting by the fire, her head resting against the back of the rocking chair, was Cora. She had fallen asleep, the heavy canvas coat still resting in her lap, her hand clutching the bone needle. Silas slowly stripped off his soaked, freezing gloves. He walked toward the fire, his boots silent on the swept floor. He looked at the pot of stew. He looked at the stacked firewood. He looked at the stacked firewood. He looked at the coat in her lap. He saw the stitches. He saw the drop of dried blood on her thumb where the needle had bitten her. He knew the thickness of that canvas. He knew the sheer, agonizing effort it would have taken a woman of her size to push a bone needle through it for hours. He looked at her face. In sleep, the lines of constant pain and fear were smoothed away. The firelight played across her features, illuminating the dark, sprawling birthmark on her neck. Silas didn't look away this time. He stared at it. He didn't see a curse. He saw the only piece of color in a world of blinding white snow and grey rock. Cora shifted, letting out a small sigh of pain, her hand instinctively reaching down to rub her bad thigh. Her eyes fluttered open. She gasped, startled to find the giant standing over her. She immediately scrambled to sit upright, clutching the coat to her chest, her hand flying to cover her birthmark in a panicked reflex. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice thick with sleep. "I fell asleep. The stew it's ready. I can fetch you a bowl." Silas didn't move. He reached down. He didn't touch her skin. He took hold of the heavy canvas coat, pulling it gently from her grip. He held it up to the firelight, inspecting the stitches. They were flawless, stronger than the original seams. He looked back at her. His face was a mask of stoic, hardened stone, but the pale ice of his eyes was cracking, revealing something entirely different underneath. "You didn't have to do this," he rasped, his voice rougher than the wind outside. "I am not a penny's worth, Mr. Boone," Cora said, her voice shaking, dropping her hand from her neck, forcing herself to sit tall despite her fear. "I will earn my keep." Silas stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He walked to the table, dropping the mended coat. "The name is Silas," he grunted, turning his back to her to hide the sudden, unfamiliar tightness in his throat. "Fetch the bowls. We eat while it's hot." They ate in a silence that was thick, not with hostility, but with a cautious, fragile truce. The stew was rich, the venison tenderized by hours of boiling, the wild onions lending a sharp, sweet bite to the dark broth. Silas ate with the methodical, focused intensity of a man who viewed food purely as fuel, yet he took a second bowl, an unspoken compliment that made a strange warmth bloom in Cora's chest. By nightfall, the sleet had transformed. It was no longer snow. It was freezing rain. It coated the Ozark crags in a thick, clear armor of solid ice. The heavy pine logs of the cabin groaned under the accumulating weight, a sound like a ship's hull straining against a deep-sea current. Silas stood by the window slit, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. The glass was opaque with frost. "The barn roof is flat-pitched," he rumbled, his voice tight. "The ice will crush the crossbeams if I don't knock it loose. The horse will be buried." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the canvas coat Cora had mended, slipping his massive arms into the sleeves. The stitches held firm, stretching but not yielding over his broad shoulders. He took a heavy iron crowbar from the corner and opened the door. The wind shrieked, driving a sheet of ice crystals into the room before he could slam the heavy oak shut behind him. Cora was left alone with the fire. She paced the length of the hearth, her ruined leg throbbing in time with the plummeting barometric pressure. She hated the dark. She hated the terrible, groaning sounds the mountain made. But mostly she hated the gnawing anxiety in her gut. He was a giant, a force of nature, but ice did not care about a man's strength. Ice only knew gravity. An hour crawled by. Then two. Cora moved to the door, resting her hand against the frozen wood. "Come back," she whispered to the grain. Suddenly a sound cut through the howling wind. Sickening, heavy crack of splintering timber, followed immediately by a dull, massive thud that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. Silas! Cora threw the iron bar up and hauled the door open. The wind knocked her backward, blinding her with freezing rain. A massive shape loomed in the darkness of the porch. Silas didn't walk in. He fell. He crashed across the threshold, hitting the floor with a terrifying dead weight. Cora slammed the door shut, cutting off the storm, and dropped to her knees beside him. He was encased in ice. His beard was a solid white block, but it was his right arm that made Cora's breath catch in her throat. It was dislocated at the shoulder, hanging at a sickening, unnatural angle, the joint visibly protruding beneath the wet canvas of his coat. His face was deathly pale, his lips carrying a faint, terrifying tinge of blue. "Roof held," he slurred, his teeth chattering so violently the words were barely intelligible. Footing gave way. Fell from the eaves. He tried to push himself up with his good arm, but his massive frame was shivering uncontrollably. Hypothermia was setting in with terrifying speed. "Don't move," Cora commanded, panic sharpening her voice into a razor. "I have to get this coat off you, but the arm is pinned." "Put it back," Silas gasped, his head lolling against the floorboards. His eyes were unfocused, glassy. "Bone." "Put it back." Cora stared at the massive span of his shoulder. "I can't. I'm not strong enough." "Boot," he gritted out, a sheen of cold sweat breaking through the frost on his forehead. "Boot in my armpit." Grab the wrist. Pull. He was slipping into shock. She had no choice. If she didn't get his wet clothes off, he would freeze to death on his own floor. Cora scrambled around him. She ignored the screaming pain in her own bad leg. She planted her good boot firmly into the hollow of his armpit to anchor his massive torso. She grabbed his thick, icy wrist with both of her small hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears of empathetic pain springing to her eyes. "Pull, Cora," he groaned. She threw her entire body weight backward, pulling with a desperate, frantic strength she didn't know she possessed. Silas roared a guttural, agonizing sound torn from the very bottom of his chest. Twack! The heavy bore of the joint popped back into the socket with a sickening, wet crunch. Silas's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went entirely limp, passing out from the sheer, overwhelming wave of pain. "Silas!" Cora scrambled to his chest, pressing her ear to his wet canvas coat. His heartbeat was there, but it was sluggish, fighting a losing battle against the cold. She worked frantically. She used his skinning knife to slice through the frozen leather laces of his boots, pulling them free. She unbuttoned the canvas coat, peeling the stiff, freezing fabric away from his torso. His undershirt was soaked with freezing sweat and melted ice. She stripped him down to his woolen long johns, her hands raw and bleeding from the cold metal of his buckles. He was too heavy to lift. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the floorboards toward the hearth. Her bad leg gave out twice, sending her crashing to her knees, but she scrambled back up, fueled by a terrifying primal need to keep him breathing. She rolled him onto the thick bear pelt near the fire and piled every buffalo robe in the cabin on top of him. It wasn't enough. His skin was like marble, terrifyingly cold to the touch. The fire could warm the air, but it couldn't penetrate the deep core freeze that had taken hold of his blood. Survival in the high mountains demanded more than wool. It demanded life. Cora didn't hesitate. The modesty the town had beaten into her vanished, replaced by the stark, undeniable mathematics of survival. She stood up. Her fingers, stiff with cold, unbuttoned her threadbare grey dress. It pulled at her feet. She stripped down to her thin, white cotton camise. She was soft, heavy-hipped, bearing the scars of her childhood fever and the dark stain on her neck. She had spent her life hiding her body, ashamed of the space it took up. Not tonight. Tonight her warmth was a weapon. She lifted the edge of the heavy buffalo robes and crawled underneath them, pressing herself directly against Silas's massive, freezing frame. The shock of his icy skin against hers made her gasp, a full-body shudder racking her frame, but she forced herself to wrap her arms around his broad chest. She pressed her soft, warm stomach against his rigid, shivering abdomen. She tangled her legs with his, burying her face in the crook of his good shoulder. "Breathe." She whispered into his icy skin, willing her own heat to transfer into him. Take it. Take the warmth. For an hour he shivered violently, his body convulsing against hers. Cora held on tight, an anchor in the dark. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside. His breathing deepened, the shallow, erratic gasps smoothing into a heavy, rhythmic rumble. Then, the fever came. As his body fought off the trauma of the cold and the relocated joint, his skin turned from marble to a burning furnace. He thrashed weakly beneath the furs, his mind slipping into the dark, tangled corridors of delirium. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice a broken, raspy scrape. "Sarah, hold on. The ice is too thick." Cora held him tighter, her hand stroking his sweat-dampened hair. "Hush now. You're warm. You're inside." He didn't hear her. His large, calloused hand came up, grasping blindly in the dark beneath the furs until his fingers locked onto her chemise. "I found them," Silas wept, a single hot tear tracking down his rugged face. It was a sound of absolute, devastating heartbreak that shattered the image of the invincible giant. "I found the stones, Pa, deep in the gorge, but they don't burn. You can't eat a diamond." She was so cold. I couldn't dig through the drift. Cora froze, her heart aching for him. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. A little sister. A brutal winter. A fortune found too late. He didn't live in the Devil's Backbone because he hated the world. He lived there to punish himself. He hoarded the diamonds because they were the very things that had failed to save the people he loved. "She is at peace," Cora whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to his fever-hot shoulder. "You didn't fail, Silas. The mountain is just cruel." His thrashing ceased. The frantic, rolling motion of his eyes beneath his eyelids slowed. The heavy, suffocating grip of his guilt seemed to loosen just a fraction at the sound of her voice. By the time the grey light of dawn filtered through the frosted window slits, the fever had broken. The cabin was silent, save for the popping of the embers in the hearth. Silas opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. He felt the heavy weight of the furs, the dull, throbbing ache in his relocated shoulder, and the astonishing, overwhelming heat pressed along the entire length of his body. He turned his head slowly. Cora was asleep, her face inches from his own. Her dark hair was splayed across his chest, her arms thrown over his torso, her soft curves pressed intimately against his hardened muscle. In the soft morning light, the birthmark on her neck was stark and visible. Silas didn't move. He barely breathed. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that his touch brought only ice and death. Yet here was a woman the town had offered for a penny, who had broken herself to drag him from the dark and poured her own life into his veins to keep him breathing. He slowly lifted his good left hand from beneath the furs. His knuckles were bruised, his skin rough as sandpaper. He reached toward her face. He didn't trace her lips. He didn't touch her hair. He laid his rough, calloused thumb directly over the sprawling, dark birthmark on her jaw. Cora stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wide, filled with a sudden vulnerability as she realized how exposed she was, how close he was. She went perfectly still, her breath catching in her throat, expecting him to pull his hand away in revulsion. Silas didn't pull away. He stroked the marked skin gently, his thumb moving with a reverence that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "You ain't broken, Cora," Silas whispered, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated in the quiet cabin. "You're just marked by the fire, like the mountain." A tear slipped from the corner of Cora's eye, tracking hot over his thumb. It was the first time in her life a man had looked at her flaw and called it a part of her strength. He shifted his weight, closing the microscopic distance between them, and pressed his forehead against hers. "You stayed," he breathed. "I told you," Cora whispered back, her hands finding the thick muscle of his chest. "I'm not a penny's worth. I'm yours. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below." The thaw of the Ozarks did not arrive with the gentle, weeping melt of a polite spring. It arrived with the violent, cracking groan of the earth tearing itself free from a 4-month coma. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Cora and Silas in a fragile, healing intimacy, was shattered by the roar of the swollen gorge. Black meltwater and sludge tore through the ravine below the cabin, carrying boulders the size of wagons in its frothing, icy jaw. Inside the cabin, the air had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of a man waiting to die. It smelled of wood smoke, roasting rabbit, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine needles Cora had swept across the floorboards. Her limp was still there, a permanent hitch in her step, but the heavy, crushing shame that used to accompany it had vanished. She moved with purpose. Silas watched her from the heavy oak table, his right shoulder stiff but functioning, his pale eyes tracking her every movement with a fierce, territorial possessiveness. He had become a sentinel, and she had become his half. Crack. The sound was faint, barely cutting through the noise of the rushing water outside. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a dry branch snapping beneath the iron shoe of a horse. Silas froze. The oiled rag he was running over the breech of his Sharps buffalo rifle stopped moving. He didn't turn his head. He merely shifted his eyes toward the heavy timber door. The wind shifted, blowing up from the valley. It pushed a scent through the chinks in the logs: sweat, wet leather, and cheap tobacco. Silas stood up. He didn't make a sound. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace that belied his massive size. He reached Cora, who was standing by the washbasin, and clamped a large, calloused hand firmly over her mouth. She gasped against his palm, her eyes flying wide in panic. "Shh," Silas breathed, his face inches from hers. "Do not make a sound." He removed his hand. Cora swallowed, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding her tongue. She saw the grim, lethal set of his jaw. The gentle man who had traced her birthmark in the firelight was gone, replaced entirely by the ghost of the backbone. "What is it?" she mouthed. "Company," Silas whispered, his voice a low, vibrating grind. "They found the trail." Cora's blood ran cold. The memory of the town square, the auction block, the cruel laughter of Oakhaven washed over her in a suffocating wave. "Get to the cellar," Silas commanded softly. He didn't give her time to argue. He grabbed her arm, guiding her toward the center of the room. He dropped to his knees, his fingers finding a recessed iron ring in the floorboards. He heaved upward. The heavy trapdoor lifted, revealing the black, yawning maw of the root cellar. It smelled of damp earth and sprouting potatoes. "Down," Silas ordered. Cora scrambled down the wooden ladder, her bad leg throbbing in protest. The cellar was freezing, a cramped earthen box no larger than a grave. Silas leaned over the opening, his broad shoulders blocking out the light. He pressed a heavy, bone-handled hunting knife into her trembling hand. "You stay in the dark," Silas told her, his pale eyes burning with a fierce, holy violence. "If this door opens and the face looking down ain't mine, you push this blade up and you don't stop pushing. You hear me? Silas, they'll kill you," she choked out, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am the mountain," Silas rumbled. "They just walked into the teeth." He dropped the trapdoor. The heavy thud plunged Cora into absolute suffocating blackness. She heard the scrape of the heavy table being dragged over the door, hiding it from view. Outside, the morning gloom was shattered by a voice that made Cora's stomach violently heave. "Boone!" It was Horace Bloodhorn. His voice was breathless from the ascent, dripping with a mixture of terror and overwhelming greed. "Silas Boone, come out of the cabin. We know you're in there. I had those stones appraised in Little Rock. You paid a fortune for a crippled stray, which means you have a hoard hidden up here." Silas stood in the center of the cabin. He checked the action of the Sharps. He pulled a massive iron-headed tomahawk from the mantel and slid it through his belt. He picked up a heavy, twin-barreled coach gun. "We brought a posse, Boone," Bloodhorn shrieked from the tree line. 10 men. Give us the rest of the diamonds and we'll leave you be. We'll even take the stained girl off your hands, free of charge." The insult hit Silas harder than a physical blow. He kicked the heavy oak door open. He didn't wait for them to aim. He stepped out onto the porch, a towering silhouette against the dark interior of the cabin. He raised the coach gun. Boom! The deafening roar of black powder shattered the morning. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the slushy yard. A hired gun 20 yards away took the brunt of the buckshot in the chest. He flew backward into a snowbank, his rifle clattering against the rocks. "Fire!" Bloodhorn screamed in panic. "Kill the beast!" A volley of rifle fire erupted from the tree line. Bullets hammered the thick black pine logs of the cabin, sending deadly splinters the size of daggers flying across the porch. Silas dropped to one knee, the heavy wood absorbing the lead. He dropped the empty coach gun. He brought the sharps up to his shoulder. He didn't shoot blindly. He waited for a muzzle flash. Crack. The buffalo gun roared. A man in the trees shrieked, a high, wet sound that was instantly silenced. "Flank him!" a gunman yelled over the ringing echoes. "Get around the back!" 3 men broke from the cover of the rocks, churning through the freezing mud toward the side of the cabin. Silas smirked, a terrifying, humorous baring of teeth. He abandoned the porch, vaulting over the railing, landing in the mud with a heavy splash. He didn't fight like a gentleman. He fought like an apex predator defending its den. He moved through the slush with terrifying speed. He met the first flanker with the heavy brass stock of the sharps crushing the man's jaw. He dropped the rifle, pulling the tomahawk from his belt, and waded into the remaining 2 men in a flurry of visceral, bloody violence. The yard became a slaughterhouse of steam, red snow, and the sounds of breaking bone. But Silas had been drawn away from the cabin walls. Down in the blackness of the root cellar, Cora held her breath. The noise above was a terrifying cacophony of gunfire, screams, and the heavy, bone-jarring thuds of men dying in the snow. She knelt on the damp earth, gripping the bone handle of the knife. Suddenly, the shooting stopped. There was only the sound of heavy, frantic boots inside the cabin above her. But they weren't Silas's measured, heavy footfalls. They were erratic, sliding on the floorboards. Glass shattered at the back of the cabin. The rear window had been broken in. "Where is it?" a voice wheezed above her. "Bloodhorn, where's the horde?" Cora's heart stopped. She heard the table being shoved violently aside, the wood shrieking in protest. The iron ring rattled. The trapdoor was yanked open. Grey light flooded the cellar, blinding her for a fraction of a second. Standing at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the light, was Horace Bloodhorn. His face was scratched and bleeding from climbing through the broken window, his eyes wild with a manic, desperate greed. He peered down into the gloom. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, his face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious triumph. "Well, well," Bloodhorn panted, aiming a heavy Colt revolver down at her. "The penny girl. Come on up, Cora, nice and slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." Cora didn't move. She gripped the knife tighter, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. "I said, come up," Bloodhorn roared, cocking the hammer of the pistol. The metallic click echoed in the small space. "Unless you want to die in a hole." Cora slowly stood, her bad leg shaking. She climbed the ladder awkwardly, stepping out onto the cabin floor. Bloodhorn backed away, keeping the gun trained on her chest. "Where are the stones, you ugly bitch? He paid a fortune for you." "He wouldn't keep it far." "I don't know," Cora whispered, backing slowly toward the massive stone hearth. "Yah!" Bloodhorn spat, stepping closer. "You've been warming his bed all winter. You know where the beast hides his meat." Cora backed up until her heel hit the stone lip of the fireplace. The memory of the auction block, the cold wind, the laughter of the town, it all rushed back. But it didn't bring fear this time. It brought an inferno of rage. She was not a broken thing. She was a survivor who had saved a giant from the ice. Her hand, hidden behind her back, felt the heavy cast-iron fire poker resting against the stone. It was 3 feet long, thick as a wrist, and topped with a jagged hook for moving burning logs. "I'll count to 3, Bloodhorn wheezed, leveling the pistol at her marked neck. 1. Cora's fingers wrapped tightly around the cold iron handle. 2. Cora didn't close her eyes. She didn't weep. She looked at the man who had tormented her, who had treated her father like garbage, who had come to destroy the only home she had ever known. She swung. She didn't try to stab him with the knife. She brought the massive iron fire poker out from behind her back in a brutal 2-handed horizontal arc, putting every ounce of her body weight and the momentum of her turning hips into the blow. Crunch! The heavy iron hook slammed directly into the side of Bloodhorn's right knee. The sound of the patella shattering was sickeningly loud, like a dry branch snapping under a boot. Bloodhorn didn't just scream, he shrieked a high, inhuman sound of absolute agony. The pistol fired wildly into the ceiling rafters as his leg collapsed inward at a grotesque angle. He crashed to the floorboards, dropping the gun, clutching his ruined knee, weeping and thrashing in the dirt. Cora stood over him, heaving, her chest rising and falling. She still gripped the heavy iron poker. She looked wild. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. The heavy, splintered front door was kicked violently open. Silas burst into the room. He was covered in mud, soot and blood that wasn't his own. The tomahawk was still gripped tightly in his massive hand. He was panting, his pale eyes wild with panic, expecting to find her dead. He looked at the shattered window. He looked at the screaming, writhing auctioneer on the floor. And he looked at Cora. She stood tall, the birthmark on her neck flushed dark with adrenaline, the heavy iron weapon in her hands. She met his gaze, her breathing ragged, but her eyes steady. He wanted the diamonds, Cora said, her voice shaking but fiercely unapologetic. I told him the price was too high. Silas stared at her. The heavy, iron-headed tomahawk in his hand tricked a slow, steady rhythm of crimson onto the swept pine floorboards. He looked from the defiant, chest-heaving woman holding the iron poker to the blubbering, broken mass of Horace Bloodhorn on the ground. The scent of black powder, copper, and the sharp acidic tang of Bloodhorn's terrified urine filled the enclosed space. The ghost of the backbone, the feral killer who had just decimated a posse of armed men in the freezing mud, felt his knees go weak. Not from the bullet graze burning a hot trail across his left rib cage, nor from the exhaustion settling deep in his bones, but from the sheer, terrifying realization of how close he had come to losing her. Silas crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He didn't look at the gun. He reached down with his free hand, grabbing Bloodhorn by the thick wool collar of his expensive coat. "My leg!" Bloodhorn shrieked, his face pale and slick with a sickening sweat as his shattered knee dragged uselessly across the floor. "My leg is gone! Don't kill me! The marshals will hang you!" Silas dragged him like a sack of rotted grain toward the shattered front door. "There ain't no marshals in the throat," Silas grunted, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that rumbled in his chest. "Just the crows and the ice." He hauled the screaming auctioneer out onto the porch and threw him down the steps. Bloodhorn hit the freezing, blood-stained mud with a heavy splash, howling in agony as his ruined knee took the impact. The surviving members of his posse, the 2 men who could still walk, were already scrambling down the switchbacks, leaving their boss to the mercy of the mountain. "Crawl!" Silas bellowed into the freezing wind, his pale eyes blazing with a holy, terrifying wrath. "Crawl back to Oakhaven. Tell them what the penny buys. If any man steps foot on this rock again, I won't use the guns. I'll use the traps." He turned his back on the weeping, pathetic creature in the mud and walked back inside, kicking the heavy, splintered oak door shut with his boot. He dropped the heavy iron bar into place. The adrenaline that had fueled his feral rage evaporated, leaving a crushing, hollow exhaustion in its wake. Silas dropped the tomahawk. It hit the floor with a dull thud. He leaned heavily against the log wall, his massive shoulders slumping, his chest heaving as he gasped for the thin mountain air. Blood seeped through the tear in his canvas shirt, a dark spreading stain over his ribs. Cora dropped the fire poker. It clattered against the hearthstone. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink away from the gore coating his hands or the wild, untamed violence that still radiated from his massive frame. She hurried to him, her bad leg dragging, her hands reaching out to press against his chest. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice trembling now that the immediate threat was gone. "Silas, sit down. You're bleeding." "It's a scratch," he wheezed, but he allowed her to guide him to the heavy oak table. He sank onto the bench, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Cora fetched the wash basin, breaking the thin crust of ice that had formed over the water, and grabbed a clean rag. She tore a strip of linen from her own petticoat. She returned to his side, her small hands moving with practiced, gentle efficiency as she unbuttoned his torn shirt. The bullet had gouged a shallow furrow across his ribs, painful, bleeding freely, but not lethal. She washed the blood and soot from his skin. Silas hissed as the freezing water hit the raw flesh, his massive hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at the wound. He looked at her. He looked at the dark birthmark on her neck, flushed with the heat of exertion. He looked at the way she braced her weight on her good leg, ignoring her own pain to tend to his. He saw the fire poker resting by the hearth. I brought this to her, Silas thought, a dark, suffocating guilt rising in his throat like bile. She was suffering in the valley, and I brought her to a slaughterhouse. When the wound was tightly bound with a clean linen, Cora stepped back, wiping her blood-stained hands on her apron. "It needs stitches, but it will hold until the bleeding stops," she said softly, offering him a tentative, relieved smile. Silas didn't smile back. His face was a mask of grey, agonizing resignation. He stood up, ignoring the sharp pull of his bandaged ribs. He walked to the center of the room, dropping to his knees. He pried up a loose floorboard near the edge of the hearth and reached deep into the dark cavity beneath. He pulled out a heavy, worn leather satchel. He carried it to the table and upended it. A cascade of raw, uncut diamonds, dozens of them, some as large as walnuts, spilled across the scarred pine wood, clicking and clattering against each other. They caught the weak, grey morning light filtering through the shattered window, glowing with a dull, frozen fire. It was a king's ransom. It was the hoard Horace Bloodhorn had ruined his life trying to steal. Silas pushed the pile of stones toward Cora. "Pack them," Silas said, his voice flat, brittle, and completely devoid of the warmth they had shared the night before. Cora froze, the rag slipping from her fingers. "What?" "The pass will be clear by tomorrow," Silas continued, not meeting her eyes. He stared blankly at the stones. "The draft horse can carry you down the far side of the ridge. You won't have to go through Oakhaven. You can ride straight to the railhead in Fort Smith. You take the train east, to St. Louis or Chicago." Cora's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She stepped closer to the table. "Silas, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're rich," he growled, the words tearing at his throat like swallowed glass. He gripped the edge of the table, his broad shoulders shaking. "There's enough here to buy a mansion, to hire the best doctors for your leg, to buy silk dresses that cover your neck so no one ever looks at you sideways again. You can hire guards. You can be safe." "I am safe here," Cora pleaded, her voice cracking. "Look around!" Silas roared, the sudden volume making her flinch. He gestured wildly to the shattered window, the splintered door, the blood staining the floorboards. "Does this look safe? I am a violent man, Cora. I live in a violent place. I bought you to save you from a cruel joke, but I brought you into a crossfire. I can't protect you from the world when I'm the thing the world is hunting." He looked at her then, his pale grey eyes swimming with a grief so profound it seemed to age him a decade in a single second. "You are too good for this dirt, Cora. You are too soft for a monster like me. Take the stones. Go live in the light." Cora stared at the pile of diamonds. They were the answer to every hungry night of her childhood, the answer to the mocking laughter of the town, the key to a life of unimaginable ease. She looked at the heavy leather satchel. She picked it up. She swept her arm across the table, scooping the massive, raw stones back into the bag. The leather grew heavy, pregnant with a terrifying amount of wealth. Silas closed his eyes, his chest caving in on itself. "It is right," he told himself, fighting the agonizing burn behind his eyelids. "She deserves to be cherished in a soft place." Cora gripped the heavy satchel with both hands. She turned her back to him. But she didn't walk to the door. She limped to the back of the cabin, toward the window Bloodhorn had shattered. The cold mountain wind howled through the jagged opening, carrying the deafening roar of the swollen, icy gorge hundreds of feet below. She lifted the heavy bag to the wooden sill. "Cora?" Silas asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" Cora didn't hesitate. She pushed. The heavy leather satchel tumbled out the window. There was no grand sound, no dramatic explosion. Just a long, silent drop followed by a distant, heavy splash as a fortune in raw diamonds hit the frothing, icy meltwater of the gorge, swallowed instantly and forever by the mountain. Silas's eyes flew wide open. His jaw dropped, the breath rushing from his lungs. "Woman, are you mad? That was your freedom. That was a kingdom." Cora turned back to face him. The grey light framed her silhouette, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She didn't look like a ruined, broken girl. She looked like a queen standing in the heart of her own impenetrable fortress. "Freedom from what?" she demanded, stepping away from the window, closing the distance between them. "From you? From the only man who ever looked at my face and didn't turn away? From the man who froze his own blood to keep a roof over my head?" She walked right up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look down into her fierce, tear-filled eyes. "You think a bag of rocks makes me safe?" Cora asked, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, consuming love. "I lived in a town full of civilized men, Silas, and they put me on a block and laughed at my body. I don't want a soft life. I don't want a civilized man." She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his torn, bloody shirt, and yanked him downward. He stumbled, his knees giving way under the sheer, unexpected force of her conviction. He fell to his knees on the pine floorboards, his face level with her waist. "I was offered for a cent," Cora whispered fiercely, her hands coming up to cradle his massive, scarred face. "I am choosing you for free." Silas broke. The heavy iron walls he had built around his soul for 10 years shattered into dust. A ragged, choking sob ripped out of his massive chest. He wrapped his thick arms entirely around her waist, burying his face into her stomach, holding onto her with a desperate, holy reverence. "My Cora," he wept, the tears soaking into the fabric of her apron, washing away the blood and the soot. "My wife, my heart. I am right here," she whispered, stroking his thick, dark hair, feeling the violent trembling of his broad shoulders slowly begin to ease. "I am not going anywhere, giant. The mountain is mine now, too." He held her there in the ruins of the fight, the cold wind blowing through the shattered glass, the fire popping in the hearth. The diamonds were gone, lost to the river, but as Silas Boone held the woman who had chosen his darkness over the world's light, he knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that he had never been richer. Epilogue, 4 years later. The summer sun in the Ozarks was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the rugged peaks of the Devil's Backbone into a lush, vibrant canopy of emerald pine and blooming mountain laurel. The cabin had changed. It was no longer a dark, brooding cave built for a solitary beast. The logs had been rechinked with bright clay. A wide wraparound porch had been added, facing the valley below, catching the warm southern drafts. The shattered back window was now a beautiful pane of clear glass that let the morning light flood the swept wooden floors. On the porch, sitting in a heavy, hand-carved rocking chair, was Silas. He wore a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, scarred forearms. He was using a small knife to carve a wooden horse out of a block of soft cedar. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful peace. The screen door creaked open. Cora stepped out onto the porch. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, the collar open, her dark hair pinned loosely up. The jagged, dark birthmark on her neck was fully exposed, kissed by the sun. She moved with her pronounced limp, the uneven gait of familiar, steady rhythm on the floorboards, but she moved with total, unshakable confidence. She was carrying a wooden tray with 2 tin cups of sweet tea, and strapped to her chest in a woven cotton sling was a sleeping infant with a mop of thick, dark hair. Silas stopped carving. He set the knife down and stood up, moving instantly to take the heavy tray from her hands, setting it on the small table. He didn't sit back down. He wrapped a massive arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, his large hand coming up to gently cup the back of the sleeping baby's head. "He's finally asleep," Cora whispered, leaning her head against Silas's broad shoulder with a contented sigh. "He has your lungs, Silas. He was screaming at the barn cat for an hour." Silas chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated against her side. "He's a boon. We like to make sure the mountain knows we're here." He turned his head, pressing a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the dark birthmark on her neck. Cora smiled, turning her face into his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. They stood together on the porch, looking out over the jagged, beautiful wilderness that had once been a prison of grief, but was now a kingdom of their own making. Down in the deep gorge, beneath tons of rushing water and silt, a fortune in raw diamonds lay buried and forgotten. Up on the ridge, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun, the giant and his queen held everything that mattered, wealthy beyond measure, entirely and perfectly free.